Alright, so if you haven't read through the description for number 3 from 2018 AP Computer Science A, take a moment now to pause the video and read through the specs. But we're gonna go ahead and get started here. So for this one, what we're doing now is we're looking at implementing an interface called string checker. String checker looks like has one abstract method called isValid. And so if we know that we're going to write a class that implements an interface, we want to make sure that we actually implement whatever abstract method is there. The easy thing that we know that we can do is figure out, well, what's the name of the class we're making? The name of the class we are making is called code word checker. So let's handle a very simple. Let me just go. No, I can't. The class header. So public class code word checker. Code word checker. And then the keyword implements. We are implementing an interface. The name of the interface is string checker. String checker. So there we go. We've handled a very simple class header. Alright, so from here we got to figure out the next step to handle. Some of the easier things to implement would be, let's include the abstract method that we have to include. The abstract method we have to include is going to be public boolean is valid. We don't know yet how to implement this, but we do know we have to include it. And because this is not an abstract class, any abstract methods that we include must have a body so that it is no longer an abstract method. Okay, so from there, let's see what we can figure out. We don't have a constructor yet, right? So usually when you're writing a class, you have a constructor. And the good news is they're giving us an example here of how you instantiate this object. Typically when you're instantiating a class, right, we have the new keyword followed by the use of the constructor, and based on how they're using that constructor, we can figure out some of the parameters, and those parameters are typically tied to our instance variable for that class. So it looks like a code word checker is going to take an int followed by another int followed by a string. So we can handle that right away. So constructor, of course, has to match the name of our class, code word checker. And now we figure out our parameters. We have a first one, min, second one, the max, and then finally some string. Sorry, I'm lazy about that. So that's one. And then after reading through, okay, so let's handle this one first. If we're gonna take in the min, the max, and the s, let's figure out what these means. The min here, the first number that we're giving, is gonna specify the minimum length for the word, and so a code word checker class needs to keep track of that. So up here we need those instance variables. Again, if they're gonna pass them in through the constructor, typically that class is gonna use them somewhere, right? And because we know we're dealing with this type of course, we know that they're probably mostly going to be the instance variables. So public, we know we have an int, min length, private int max length, and then finally private string. So the string, let's figure out what we want to call it. The string is a code word, okay? So let's just call it code word. Alright, important thing to remember, right? When we're adding instance variables, you want to try to hide as much data as possible. So you're going to try to make sure you remember to make those instance variables private. Alright, so now let's go ahead and assign those within our constructor. So the min length is equal to, let's assign it the value that's being passed into the constructor. Max length, same thing. And then code word is equal to s. Right, so a very typical constructor here. When you're reading through the problem statement, you then figure out that there's another way that you can instantiate a code word checker. In this case, what all you want to do is pass in the code word and not specify the min and max. If they don't specify the min and max, they default to 6 and 20. That's what it looks like here. So let's write out our second constructor. Our second constructor takes in one parameter, the code word. So that is going to be a string. String, because I'm lazy. Okay. Min length, again as defined, is going to be 6. Max length is going to be 20. And then our code word is equal to s. Alright, so we handled our two constructors very, very good. Again, the majority of figuring out how they work and what we should specify as parameters were always through the examples. So right here, handled that, and then finally we handled this. Alright, so the next one is we included that abstract method and we added a body because we know that this class has to implement it, right? Any class that implements an interface, unless it's also an abstract class, must implement those abstract methods, right? So you're claiming that you implement a string checker, and what it means to be a string checker is that you have a method called isValid that works for however you as a class define it to work. In this case, it looks like whatever's being passed in, right? So if we take a look, this method takes in a string, and what we're going to do is we're going to determine if the string, the parameter, is within the specifications. One, it must meet the minimum length requirement and the maximum length requirement. It has to be in between or at the borders. It's inclusive in that regard. And then finally, that string cannot have the code word in it at all. And that should be pretty easy. And so that's just a very simple string of booleans. Oops, messed that up. So we're gonna do return 1. The string has to be at least the minimum requirement. Length must be greater than or equal to min length. Okay, good. So now we have to make sure it's not too long. So str.length must be less than or equal to max length. Good. Finally, we have to make sure that the code word does not exist. And what we can do is use the index of method. Index of for strings will either return a positive 0 integer or a negative number, -1. And so we're going to say if we're going to return the result of str dot index of the code word that's stored within this guy, and then we're going to check that it returned a -1. Okay, and that's pretty much it. The first one there checks that the word meets the minimum, meets maximum, and then finally make sure that it does not contain this substring, right? So again, just to remind you, when you're using strings, it's that length, not size. And then there's the method index of, and then the substring methods. Those are very good to know as well. But if we try to identify all the simple stuff, let's see all the ones. Let's mark this in orange. So the easy stuff that you should take care of right away would be the headers. The headers should be very, very easy. Right here. That should be automatic whenever you're writing a class. You gotta make sure you know how to do that. Two would be the header for the abstract methods that you're gonna implement. That's also another easy thing to always have. So without knowing how to code and just memorizing that you have to write these headers, that's actually fairly simple. And then if you're writing a class, you're definitely going to need constructors. So constructors right here, headers are going to be an easy way to do that. The assignments within the constructors should be pretty doable. And then the hard stuff would be, okay, as you're reading through the specifications, you're going to figure out the reasonable instance variables that you need for this class, right? So this class is going to encapsulate some data and methods. It's going to pack them up. And then finally, the hardest part would be, just trying to figure out that abstract method that you're now going to implement. How does it work for this class? That might have been the hardest part, but there were still a lot of easy checkpoints along the way to get you halfway there. Thanks.